50 years ago, philanthropist Louis Schweitzer, who was passionate about justice for ordinary people, learned that poor defendants who could not afford to post bail were being held in crowded New York City jails for weeks or even months awaiting trial. He recognized an injustice and hired a young journalist, Herb Sturz, to develop an alternative to setting bail for such people. With cooperation from New York City officials, an experiment was conducted. Those with strong community ties were released on their own recognizance, a radical idea at the time. The hypothesis that such people did not pose a flight risk proved true. Almost all did show up in court. And as a result, that not only improved the system itself, but resulted in huge cost savings to the New York City jail system. The Manhattan Bail Project, begun in 1961, led to the first reform of the federal bail system since the writing of the U.S. Constitution. This project launched the Vera Institute of Justice. From the very beginning, Vera has been committed to making the justice system fairer, more humane, and effective and more efficient. And that includes things like making sure we're not overusing very punitive, very expensive incarceration, and we're making sure that policing is done respectfully and fairly. We have always worked with government partners, often quietly and behind the scenes, toward this end. Our work is founded on evidence-based research to understand how systems are currently working. That research often identifies why systems are not working, as well as they should, and suggests how those systems might be improved. For instance, Vera learned that young offenders were being sentenced to incredibly expensive, secure placement in the equivalent of prisons for young people when they weren't threats to public safety, and that they were rearrested at a rate of 80%. That is, we were spending a fortune on young people who posed no public safety threat and essentially turning them into public safety threats. And we built alternatives to that system, and now the number of kids in New York who goes to those systems have been reduced by about 2/3. What began in New York City has grown into a national organization. We are now actively engaged in work across the country, helping New Orleans develop safe alternatives to jail for many people who have been arrested and are awaiting trial, helping Los Angeles downsize its very overcrowded jail, working with Justice Department officials to ensure that the deportation proceedings against undocumented immigrants are fair, humane, and cost-effective. As an organization, our overriding objective is to always have the capacity to respond quickly and address these kinds of issues. Given the massive incarceration in the United States, often unnecessary from a public safety perspective, Vera is on the cutting edge of developing and testing alternatives. We've developed community service programs and the implementation of fines to handle low-level offenders instead of incarcerating them. We need to maintain the capacity to do this work. Some of the leverage points that make Vera successful are good relationships with government partners. Government officials trust Vera because of its track record of discretion and success. And many people at Vera, like myself, have spent a long time in government. We understand the needs that government officials have, the time frames they operate under, what's useful to them, and I think they understand that. Research capacity. We have in-house staff that are highly skilled in research and analysis. And they're not just skilled social science researchers. They engage in what we tend to call action research, which is research that's rigorous, but also done in a time frame and an accessible way that's useful for government officials to make the decisions they have to make. Demonstration projects we run test the hypotheses generated by research. Vera has the unique capacity to conceive, implement, and test new models for providing justice services. We'll look at a problem, we'll see whether there's a gap in service, and we'll develop a program on the ground to deliver that service and then evaluate it to see whether it works. We create spin-offs from successful demonstration projects. Many of our demonstration projects have been spun off and now operate as independent organizations. Safe Horizon, probably the largest victim services agency in the country, the Center for Employment Opportunities, the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, the Criminal Justice Agency, which is New York City's bail agency, CASES, which is probably the largest alternative to incarceration program in the country, Project Return, Job Path, a program for developmentally disabled people, and the Legal Action Center. We also do cost-benefit analyses. That kind of analysis let officials reliably predict budget implications of policy changes, and we do that work in a way that's realistic, that's useful to government officials, and especially to budget officials, and we make sure our numbers are real, are believable, and can be seen in the budget. One of the things that makes Vera effective is our insider relationship with our government partners. We don't seek publicity, and government agencies making the policy changes based on Vera's work get the credit. If a project fails, it's a small-scale failure by an outside organization, not a political liability for a government agency. The quality of our research, data collection, and analysis makes us successful. Vera does this better than government agencies themselves can, both because now government agencies don't have that kind of research and analytic capacity, and especially now they're under so much pressure just to maintain basic operations. Our ability to create and test demonstration projects set us apart. They allow us to show whether systematic improvement is feasible. Many of our successful demonstration projects go to scale, either by becoming part of government operations or spinning off as an independent, not-for-profit organization. One of our theories of change is that the only way we can scale up these projects that we believe are successful is to make them independent and not keep them. And the only way they can grow is to operate as an independent organization. And one of the things I think that points to the success of that is that many of our spin-offs are much larger than we are now, and that just wouldn't have happened had we kept them all in our organization. And finally, because we are not an advocacy organization, we don't challenge government officials publicly. They're willing to take a chance on reform because we work with them, not against them. One of the best metrics for measuring our success is the reduction of unnecessary incarceration. For example, in our work on reforming the juvenile justice system in New York City, Vera developed a risk instrument that would predict whether juveniles would reappear and would reoffend awaiting trial. And we did that because we wanted to make sure that judges put only kids who were a public safety threat or a flight risk in jail, and didn't put kids who were low risk in jail. And we wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. One, for public safety reasons. You want to make sure that you're holding kids who are a public safety threat. But research also shows that if you overpunish low-risk offenders, you turn them into high-risk offenders. And one of the things New York City was doing was turning low-level offenders into high-level offenders. We developed that risk instrument based on about 20,000 cases that had gone through the juvenile justice system over a number of years. And now judges use that tool in their decisions about whether to incarcerate a kid pre-trial or not. There are other examples. For instance, the Manhattan Bowery Project, which we ran about 40 years ago, put Bowery alcoholics into voluntary treatment instead of jail. And the genesis of that project was Vera approaching the New York Police Department and suggesting that taking alcoholics off the street, putting them in jail for a few days where they'd simply get sick, and then putting them out in the street again where they would once again get sicker and start drinking, was basically a cost not worth doing and did absolutely nothing for public safety or their problems. What we suggested was that the police help us take those alcoholics to detox centers and hospitals to treat the addiction itself. And that was one of the projects that turned out to do exactly what we thought it would do. It decreased alcoholism, certainly on the Bowery. If you look at the Bowery today, it looks nothing like the Bowery of 30 or 40 years ago. And in that case, we effectively took a behavior that the police were treating as a crime, medicalized it, and used the health system to treat it instead of the criminal justice system. Vera is not well known to the general public. Historically, we have purposely maintained a low profile, and that has generally served us well and helped us to be effective. At the same time, given the long lead time to get a government contract or grant and the parallel long funding cycle with most major foundations, we are not able to be as nimble and responsive as we would like to be as an organization. We're very purposely making attempts to change some of this and to get better at it. Specifically, we're upping and becoming much more active in our development efforts, especially around raising private money and general fund money in particular, which will allow us to be more nimble and more entrepreneurial. We're strategically raising our profile in the media so our government and private funders know us better and understand what we do, but always we stay true to our core methods and values. There are a number of major accomplishments that Vera has had over its 50 years. The Manhattan Bail Project is perhaps one of the most well-known ones, and that project, for the first time in U.S. history, made bail possible for poor people. With cooperation from New York City officials, Vera ran an experiment to see if arrested individuals with strong community ties would show up in court if released after arrest. In fact, after we evaluated it, almost all of them did. That project led to the first reform of the federal bail system since the writing of the United States Constitution. Vera has, over our 50 years, spun off 29 projects, 17 as freestanding not-for-profits, working for improved justice in society. The other 12 have been absorbed into government operations. So there are a few examples of all of them. The New York City Criminal Justice Agency is the city's bail agency. It provides pretrial services, and those services have been imitated in dozens of cities around the country. And just to give a sense of the volume of work they do, they interview in New York City almost 400,000 people a year who are arrested, and for every one of them they collect data and make recommendations to judges about whether to release them on their own recognizance or not. Based on that work, New York City releases over 50% of everyone arrested at the first court appearance, more than any city in the country, and I should note that New York City also, along with that, has had the largest crime reduction of any city in the country as well. One of our other hugely successful spin-offs is called the Center for Employment Opportunities, and that provides job training and immediate supported work for those who leave prison. It's designed to find employment for people, that is, convicted felons returning to their communities from prison, for whom work is very difficult to find. And in fact, statistics and evaluation have showed that it's both successful in finding jobs and in preventing recidivism. Accessoride, which is one of the projects that Vera developed years ago, provides transportation for senior citizens and other vulnerable populations unable to get around on their own. We've done a lot of work on policing, especially community policing, and have worked with the New York Police Department to train police officers to work as part of the community they serve. That type of policing, community policing, some call it problem-solving policing, builds better rapport and has better outcomes. The youth justice work we do in New York and around the country results in less punitive and more effective and better outcomes for kids and communities. What seems to be common in the youth justice field in the United States is that we incarcerate huge numbers of juveniles for a great cost, and the recidivism rates can be as high as 80%. That is, we're spending huge amounts of money to incarcerate children, and basically, as a result of that investment, turning them in to better criminals. One of the pieces of work that Vera is very concentrated on is making sure that only kids who should be incarcerated are incarcerated, and that the great majority of kids are handled in the community and provided services for them and their families to make sure that they deal with the problems that got them into trouble in the first place. But what we want to make sure of is that we're not spending huge amounts of money to separate them from their families and communities, only to have them go to adult jail when they come back. Our immigration work is designed to eliminate systemic inefficiencies and the unnecessary injustices that accompany them. There are huge numbers of people now in our immigration system in the United States. We want to make sure that none of them are there longer than they have to be, that there are not unnecessary delays, that we're not spending money unnecessarily, and that we have alternatives to that detention system for people that don't have to be in their detention system as their case winds through the immigration courts. Our international work takes a variety of forms and happens in a number of places around the globe. One of those places is China, and we're helping China develop the ability to conduct data-based reform. And what that means is the Chinese government is now allowing several of its senior judges and academics to make some reform efforts in its criminal justice system. One of the projects that's happening in China with our government partners is trying to reform the Chinese interrogation system, is to try to build a professional defense system, and to try to build alternatives to incarceration for adults and juveniles. And the way we do that work is that we help our partners build demonstration programs to test these new ideas, and we provide them with help in developing the social science and evaluation capacity to make sure those ideas work and then help them take them up to scale. Our work in Africa is basically work that we do through the United Nations, develop empirically based tools to measure rule of law in post-conflict societies. Those societies now include Haiti, Liberia, and Southern Sudan, and the purpose of that is develop baseline measures to see how those countries are doing over time in their rule of law and to make sure that the most vulnerable populations in those countries are protected by the rule of law. The problems Vera work on, especially in the justice systems, tend to be hyper-political and involve high risk and often evoke strong emotional reactions. Our approach is dispassionate, analytical, and based on hard data. Even so, we recognize that this is a very political realm. We understand the political pressures that government officials are under, and we are very attentive to the politics, though our approach is based on empirical research and data. And that data is often very difficult to get. So New Orleans, for example, is a city where things like turf and politics have stymied innovation for years. Vera's been working there since 2005, building rapport with officials, encouraging cooperation, and in fact seeing real changes. And some of those changes take the form of the average pretrial incarceration time fallen from 60 days to 6 days. It's a huge reduction. It was not easy to make. It's worth understanding a bit of the context in New Orleans. In New Orleans, the DA has always had 45 days to even file a misdemeanor charge once someone's in jail, and 60 days to file a felony charge. So at that point, it's not even pre-trial, it's pre-charge. And historically, DAs have taken that full time. So you have thousands of people in jail during that time, awaiting even the charge being filed. One of our first projects in New Orleans was to try to convince the city, the police, the DA, to shrink that time to just a few days, because you wouldn't be holding non-serious cases for longer than you had to, and you'd be forced to start doing the serious work for violent cases as early as possible, which you want to do for public safety. And after a number of meetings, convening work groups, doing a number of sort of facilitation sessions, we started a pilot project where police started to deliver to the district attorney's offices their arrest reports within 5 or 6 days. And then within a day or two after that, the DA would file the formal charge. That's an example of a project that we did that took a while to get off the ground. It started slowly, but once the criminal justice practitioners started to do it, it became incredibly evident that it was in their self-interest to do it, not just their own agency's self-interest, but the city's self-interest. And in a fairly short period of time, the whole system changed, which is why that pre-charge time has been reduced by about 90% in New Orleans. This is a historic moment of opportunity in the United States for criminal justice reform. The fiscal crisis, both on a national and a local, a state level, is generating huge demand for criminal justice reform because with the kind of declining resources that states and localities have, they simply cannot anymore continue to support huge, ever-expanding criminal justice systems. They simply cannot do it. And the demand for the kind of work we do is at its highest level since we've been around for the last 50 years. And again, not just because there's no resources, which is hugely important, but there's been some fairly significant shifts in public opinion that's willing to use alternative to incarceration, especially for low-level offenders, that's willing to reform juvenile justice systems. And those changes in public opinion, combined with the financial state of governments, really creates a moment, a historical moment for reform. And with additional funding, with more funding, we can build the capacity to try to address a lot of that reform. We simply don't have the capacity right now to respond to all the demands for our services that come to us. Local levels want to do something about their jail systems. States want to do something about their prison systems. They want to reorganize their criminal justice systems to make them less costly and more effective. And we know, based on our work and the research, that there are ways to do that. But we have a limited capacity. We have a limited ability to provide to all those demands for service. But we'd love to be able to do that, both because that's what we do, that's the work we want to do, but we also realize that for the next 5 to 10 years, there's a real moment here to change systems that have been in need of reform for the last 40 years. And the door is open for that kind of reform, and we need to walk through it. With more resources, one of the things we would do is redouble our efforts about working on policing issues, especially on looking at problem solving and community policing, but also paying particular attention to a variety of aggressive policing policies, probably most notably stop and frisk policies, which are a huge issue in New York City, but becoming a larger issue in other big cities as well. Those policies of stopping and frisking huge numbers of people, mostly people of color, have become big political issues in cities around the country, but no one quite knows how effective they are, if it works or to what extent, what the consequences are for the people who are stopped and their families. And as Vera always do, we plan to study all phases of this, from the police point of view, from a government's point of view, and from the community point of view. And we plan and would love to make a big effort to do that work nationally. In many cities around the country, chronic absence from school prompts Child Protective Services. And what that means is Child Protective Service agencies open an investigation into the kid and the parents. Our studies on this show that that's appropriate, but only for small kids whose attendance depend on their parents. But in fact, most kids who are absentees from school, chronic absentees, are teenagers, and a different response is needed from its child welfare response to get those kids back into school. We need to focus different parts of government on truancy, not just child welfare agencies. The educational system, social service agencies, recreational agencies. There are a variety of reasons why teenagers don't go to school, but it's actually rarely something like neglect and abuse. It has to do with who they are, the environment they live in, and their response to their own schools. And there's a lot of work to be done on this, and we'd love to do more of it. One of the things that Vera would love to have is a research and development fund, essentially an opportunity fund, which would allow our staff to start working on projects even before they're fully funded. For instance, sometimes we have commitments from government officials who would love us to come in and help them with a problem, but we don't have the funding to do that. And so one example that happened a couple of years ago is that we had several elected district attorneys around the country who were willing to let us start looking at their data to make sure that race wasn't playing an issue in the decisions they made. We would have loved to have started that work, especially with those kind of commitments, immediately, and we simply weren't able to. We had to wait a year and a half before we got funding, and that's a real opportunity lost. If we had a research and development pot of funds, it would allow us to jump on opportunities, and we are very good at spotting opportunities, at being entrepreneurial. And because governments can change so quickly, it's key for us to be able to start a project exactly when we think a project can be started and not have to wait a year or more for funding. There are still huge gaps in the criminal justice system and in criminal justice research that need to be addressed. One is a need for research on policing and police reform. There's surprisingly little work on policing in terms of what works in policing. What are the most effective policing programs for urban areas, for suburban areas, for rural areas? There is not a body of directed work that can be helpful for those police chiefs and policymakers that can really outline what sort of policing programs are effective, why, how much, and at what cost. And that's work we really love to do. In addition, there's also huge gaps in our knowledge and work around parole and probation. While there's 2.3 million people in jail or prison in this country, that's what people tend to think of when they think of who's under criminal justice control, there's more than twice that many, over 5 million people, that are under the control of the probation and parole systems. They're hugely important systems. They handle millions of people, and the failures from those systems find their way into prison systems. So those systems wind up costing actually many, many times what we actually pay for just those systems alone. So making sure we have effective probation and parole systems, driving probation and parole reform at the county and state level is hugely, hugely important for us to have a well-functioning, effective, and fair criminal justice system at the federal level, state level, and local levels. There's a huge need in the field now, especially given the economic circumstances facing not just the federal government, but even more especially state and local governments, for believable and rigorous cost-benefit analyses to help policymakers make the decisions they need to make in incredibly tough economic times. That is, laying out what the true costs of reform are, what programs are beneficial and are effective both in dollar and public safety terms, what programs aren't, where it makes sense to invest, where it makes sense to shrink. That kind of financial and budget-related information is essential for policymakers now who are making difficult decisions every day. That kind of information is essential if we're going to reform our incredibly complicated and expensive systems of justice.